Why your mind creates worst-case scenarios. You've already lived through a disaster today. Not a real one, but your brain doesn't know the difference. Somewhere between waking up and right now, your mind took you to a place that doesn't exist yet. A conversation that went wrong. A decision that ruined everything. A future where the worst possible thing actually happened. And you felt it. In your chest. In your stomach. Like it was real. It wasn't real. But the fear was. And that's the part nobody talks about. That's the part we're going to break open today. Because what's happening inside your mind isn't random. It isn't weakness. It isn't you being dramatic or overthinking things. It is a system. An ancient, powerful, deeply human system. And once you understand how it works, you will never look at your own mind the same way again. Stay with me, because this is going to change something in you. Let's start at the beginning. Not your beginning. The beginning of all of us. Picture a world with no phones, no cities, no doctors, no safety nets. A world where the wrong decision didn't just cost you money or embarrassment. It cost you your life. Where every shadow could be a predator. Every unfamiliar sound could be your last. Every stranger could mean danger. This was the world your ancestors lived in for hundreds of thousands of years. And in that world, there were two kinds of people. The ones who assumed things would probably be okay. And the ones who always expected the worst. The optimists were relaxed, comfortable, unbothered. The worriers were tense, scanning, preparing. You might think the optimists had a better life. And maybe they did, briefly. But the worriers survived longer. They saw the threat before it arrived. They prepared for the hunt before hunger came. They anticipated the storm before the clouds gathered. And when danger finally appeared, they were ready. The optimists were often caught off guard. Evolution doesn't care about happiness. It cares about survival. So generation after generation, the worriers passed on their genes. Their anxious, threat-scanning, worst-case imagining brains were selected by nature itself. Not because worry feels good, but because worry kept people alive. And then those people had children. And those children had children. And eventually, after thousands and thousands of years of this, one of those children became you. You are the product of survivors. People who worried enough to stay alive long enough to pass on that worry to you. Your anxiety isn't a flaw in your design. It is the design. But here's the problem. The world changed. Faster than evolution could keep up. In the last 100 years alone, the world transformed more dramatically than it had in the previous 10,000. We built cities. We created medicine. We developed systems of law and safety and communication that would be completely unrecognizable to your ancient ancestors. The lions are mostly gone. The predators aren't hiding in the bushes outside your door. But your brain doesn't know that. Your brain is still running the same ancient software. Still scanning for threats. Still preparing for disasters. Still building worst-case scenarios like its life depends on it. Because for a very long time, it did. And now that same system, the one that kept humanity alive through ice ages and famines and predators and plagues, is pointed at your inbox. Your relationships. Your to-do list. Your social media notifications. Your uncertain future. The software didn't change. Only the world did. Now let's get into what's actually happening inside your brain when the spiral starts. It begins with something called the amygdala. Think of it as your brain's alarm system. It's small, about the size of an almond, and it sits deep in the center of your brain. Its entire job is to detect danger and trigger a response before your conscious mind even knows what's happening. And it is fast. Before you've had a chance to think logically about a situation, your amygdala has already made a decision. Threat or no threat. Safe or dangerous. Fight, run, or freeze. This happens in milliseconds. Faster than a blink. This is why your heart starts racing before you've even finished reading a scary text message. This is why your stomach drops when you hear your name called unexpectedly in a quiet room. Your body is already responding to a perceived threat before your brain has had time to evaluate whether the threat is even real. Now here's where the worst-case scenario machine really kicks in. Once the amygdala fires that alarm, your thinking brain, the part that's supposed to be logical and rational, gets partially hijacked. The stress chemicals flooding your system weren't designed for careful, nuanced thinking. They were designed for immediate survival. Run now. Think later. So in moments of anxiety, your brain narrows its focus. It stops seeing the full picture. It zooms in on danger. and everything it imagines is filtered through that lens. This is why when you're anxious, every possible outcome feels catastrophic. Not just bad, catastrophic. Your brain isn't interested in the 90% chance that things will be fine. It's obsessed with the 10% chance that everything falls apart. Because in the ancient world, that 10% could kill you. So it demands all your attention. And then comes the rehearsal. Your brain, in its desperate attempt to protect you, starts running simulations. What if this happens? What if they say that? What if I fail? What if it all goes wrong? It plays these scenarios out in vivid detail. It casts you as the main character in a disaster film, and it watches the ending over and over again. Not because it enjoys your suffering, but because it thinks that if it prepares you for the worst won't destroy you when it comes. It is trying to save you from pain by giving you pain in advance. And the more you watch those mental simulations, the more real they feel, the more certain they seem, the more your body responds as if the disaster is actually happening. Your cortisol rises, your muscles tighten, your sleep suffers, your mood drops. You are living through an experience that exists only in your imagination, and your biology treats it like it's completely real. This is the cruelest trick the mind plays on itself. Let's talk about something called negativity bias, because this is where things get really interesting. Your brain does not treat all experiences equally. It never has. Negative information, threats, failures, embarrassments, losses get stored more quickly, processed more deeply, and remembered more vividly than positive information. Think about it in your own life. You could receive 10 compliments and 1 criticism in a single day. Which one do you still think about before you fall asleep? The criticism. Every time. This isn't a character flaw. This is your brain doing exactly what it evolved to do. Because in the ancient world, missing a positive experience, like not finding the best berry bush, had small consequences. But missing a negative experience, like not noticing the predator behind you, had fatal consequences. So your brain learned to pay much more attention to the bad. The problem is that this bias doesn't switch off just because the stakes are lower now. Your brain treats social rejection with the same intensity it once used for physical danger. It treats professional failure with the same alarm it once used for life-threatening situations. It amplifies the negative. It magnifies the risk. It turns small setbacks into catastrophic predictions. And here's what makes it even more powerful. The more you think about a negative scenario, the stronger that neural pathway becomes. It's like a path through a forest. The first time you walk it, it's overgrown and difficult. But the more you walk it, the clearer it becomes. Until eventually it feels like the natural, obvious route. Your worst-case scenarios become habits. Automatic. Familiar. The first place your mind goes whenever uncertainty appears. And uncertainty, in modern life, is everywhere. Here's something that will shift how you see all of this. There was a study done where researchers asked people to write down everything they were worried about, every worst-case scenario they were carrying. Then they tracked those people over time to see what actually happened. The results were striking. Roughly 85% of the things people worried about never happened. And for the 15% that did go wrong in some way, the majority of people reported that they handled it better than they expected, that they found ways to cope, that it wasn't as bad as their brain had predicted. Think about that for a moment. Nearly all the suffering that happens in worst-case thinking, the nights lost to anxiety, the days spent dreading outcomes, the mental and physical toll of chronic worry, that suffering is happening in response to futures that will never arrive. Your brain is billing you for disasters it placed on your calendar that will never actually occur. You are paying an emotional price for things that will never be delivered. And even the small percentage that does go wrong, you're stronger than your anxious brain gives you credit for. Because your worst-case thinking never imagines the resilience. It never factors in your ability to adapt, to find help, to discover new paths forward. It shows you the disaster. It never shows you the recovery. That is the lie inside the worst-case scenario. It shows you falling. It never shows you getting back up. Now here is the midpoint twist. And this one is going to sit with you. What if the problem isn't that you think about worst-case scenarios? What if the problem is what you believe about them when you do? Here is what most people do when the spiral starts. They try to stop it. They tell themselves to calm down. They argue with the thoughts. They try to distract themselves or push the images away. And the harder they push, the more powerful the thoughts become. You've probably experienced this. Someone tells you not to think about something, and suddenly that's all you can think about. This is called the rebound effect. When you actively try to suppress a thought, your brain has to keep that thought active in order to monitor whether you're thinking about it. You create a mental surveillance system for the very thing you're trying to avoid. And that system keeps the thought alive and close and loud. So fighting the worst-case scenario doesn't work. Suppressing it doesn't work. Distracting yourself from it doesn't work, not for long. Something else entirely is required. The answer isn't to silence the voice. It's to change your relationship with it. Think of it this way. Imagine there's a very loud, very anxious commentator inside your head. And this commentator is convinced that every game you play is going to end in disaster. They're shouting predictions of failure, describing everything that could go wrong, creating vivid, detailed breakdowns of every possible catastrophe. Now imagine you've been living your whole life inside the commentator's booth, right next to the speaker, with nowhere to go. The voice fills everything. What if you could step outside the booth? Not to silence the commentator, not to argue with them, just to create a little distance. To hear the commentary from across the room instead of directly inside your ear. The commentator is still talking, but you're no longer trapped inside the noise. That distance changes everything. This is what researchers call cognitive defusion, and it's one of the most powerful shifts in modern psychology. Most of us live completely fused with our thoughts. When a thought appears, we experience it as truth, as reality. When your brain says, "This is going to go terribly wrong," you don't experience it as a thought. You experience it as a fact, as something that is going to happen. Defusion creates separation between you and the thought. It allows you to observe the thought rather than become it. And the way you practice this is surprisingly simple. When the worst-case spiral starts, instead of experiencing the thought as reality, you label it. You notice it. You say to yourself, "My brain is running the catastrophe program right now." Not, "This is going to go terribly wrong." But, "I notice that my brain is predicting that this is going to go terribly wrong." That tiny shift, that small act of labeling, moves you from inside the thought to outside it. You go from being the character in the disaster film to being the person watching the film. And once you're watching it instead of living it, you have a choice about how seriously to take it. The thought doesn't disappear, but it loses its grip. Let's go deeper, because there's another layer to this that most people never see. Your worst-case scenarios are not random. They are not just generic fears. They are deeply personal. They target the things you care about most. They attack what matters to you. And that tells you something important. You don't have worst-case scenarios about things you don't care about. You don't lie awake at night catastrophizing about strangers in other countries failing at their jobs. You catastrophize about your own work, your own relationships, your own future, because those things matter to you. The anxiety is pointing at your values. The parent who lies awake worrying about their child's safety isn't broken. They love their child. The professional who catastrophizes about a presentation isn't weak. They care about their work. The person who spirals about a relationship ending loves the person they're with. Your worst-case thinking is a map of everything you love and everything you fear losing. This doesn't make the suffering easier, but it changes what the suffering means. It isn't evidence that something is wrong with you. It is evidence that you are a person who deeply cares, that you have things in your life worth protecting, that you are invested in your own future. The problem isn't that you care. The problem is that your ancient brain doesn't yet know how to hold care without catastrophe. Let's talk about something called the window of tolerance. Every human being has a range of emotional experience they can handle while still functioning well. When you're inside that window, you can think clearly, feel deeply, respond thoughtfully. You're present. You're functional. You're you. But when anxiety spikes, when the worst-case machine cranks into high gear, you get pushed outside that window. And when you're outside it, your ability to think rationally drops dramatically. Your brain floods with stress chemistry, and suddenly everything feels urgent, permanent, and catastrophic. Small problems feel enormous. Uncertain futures feel certain in the worst way. This is why it's almost impossible to reason your way out of a panic spiral. You can't outthink a nervous system that's in survival mode. The logical brain and the survival brain are working at cross purposes. What you need isn't better arguments against your anxiety. What you need is to get back inside the window first. And the most direct route back is through the body. Because here's something remarkable. The same nervous system that creates the anxiety response can also shut it down. And one of the fastest ways to trigger that shutdown is slow, controlled breathing. When you breathe out slowly, for longer than you breathe in, you activate a branch of your nervous system called the parasympathetic system. This is the system responsible for rest, repair, and calm. It directly counteracts the stress response. And because breathing is the one automatic function in your body that you can consciously control, it gives you a direct line to your own nervous system. You are not powerless in this. You have a switch, and your breath is how you reach it. A slow exhale is not a trick. It is a biological override. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. The worst-case scenario machine doesn't just affect how you feel. It affects how you move through the world. It shapes the decisions you make and the ones you avoid. Think about something you want to do, something you've been meaning to try, a creative project, a difficult conversation, a new direction, a leap of some kind. Now think about why you haven't done it yet. Somewhere in that hesitation is a worst-case scenario, a vivid, detailed, emotionally convincing picture of how it could go wrong. And your brain, in its ancient wisdom, is holding you back from the threat, protecting you from the predator that doesn't exist. This is called avoidance. And it is the worst-case scenario's most powerful tool. Because avoidance feels like relief. When you pull back from the thing you fear, your anxiety drops immediately. The threat recedes. The tension eases. And your brain registers this as avoidance worked, which means next time, it will push avoidance even harder. It will build the worst-case scenario even bigger. It will make the fear even louder. To make sure you stay safe. To make sure you don't walk toward the danger it's invented. Every time you avoid something because of a worst-case scenario, you teach your brain that the fear was right. You confirm the prediction without ever testing it. And the scenario grows. This is how small anxieties become phobias. How manageable fears become life-limiting walls. Not because the danger grew, but because the avoidance made the fear feel more true. The only way out is through, but not through suffering. Through small, deliberate contact with the thing you fear. Step by step, window by window. Proving to your ancient brain, through actual experience, that the disaster it's predicting doesn't live there. Let's talk about what happens in relationships. Because this is where worst-case thinking causes some of its most invisible, most painful damage. You send a message and they don't reply immediately. Your brain starts building. Maybe they're angry. Maybe you said something wrong. Maybe they're pulling away. Maybe this is the beginning of the end. By the time they finally respond 3 hours later, you have already lived through the entire collapse of the relationship. You've felt the loss. You've grieved it. You've run through the conversation where it all falls apart. And then they reply, "Sorry, was in a meeting. What's up?" And the relief is real. But so was the suffering that preceded it. All of it invented. All of it experienced as completely real. This is called anxious attachment behavior. And it's one of the most common ways worst-case thinking quietly destroys the thing it's trying to protect. Because when we're terrified of losing someone, we sometimes behave in ways that push them away. We seek constant reassurance, which exhausts people. We pull back first to avoid being left. We misread neutral signals as rejection. We turn ordinary moments into evidence of abandonment. The very fear of worst-case outcomes creates the conditions for bad outcomes. And the devastating irony is that the person doing this is usually the most loving, most invested person in the relationship. They're catastrophizing because they care so deeply, and that care, filtered through anxiety, becomes something that looks, to the outside world, like neediness or instability. But underneath it is just a person who loves someone and is terrified of losing them. A person with an ancient, overprotective brain that cannot tell the difference between a moment of silence and the end of everything. Here is something that most people never consider. Your worst-case scenarios have a style. They have a signature. They tend to hit the same themes, the same fears, the same catastrophic conclusions over and over again. Almost like a personal genre of disaster. For some people, it's always about rejection. Every uncertain situation eventually becomes a story about being left, excluded, humiliated. For others, it's always about failure. Every challenge eventually becomes a story about losing everything, being exposed, being found out. For others, it's about loss of control. Every unknown eventually becomes a story about chaos, helplessness, being overwhelmed. These patterns aren't random. They were usually formed early. In the moments in childhood where you first learned that certain situations were dangerous, where you first absorbed the lesson that this type of thing leads to pain. A child who grew up in an unpredictable household learned very early that uncertainty means danger. So their brain pattern matched unpredictable to dangerous and filed it away. Now, decades later, any situation that feels uncertain triggers that same alarm. The adult brain runs the childhood program, not because it's choosing to be irrational, but because the lesson was learned so deeply, so early, that it became automatic. You are not catastrophizing about now. In many cases, you are catastrophizing about then, about the child you were, in the situation that first taught you to be afraid. And your adult brain, not knowing this, keeps sending that child's fear into your present-day life. This is why the same anxious patterns follow people from job to job, relationship to relationship, city to city. The geography changes. The people change. But the internal program runs the same script everywhere. Until you see it. Until you name it. Until you understand where it came from. So how do you actually change this? Not manage it. Change it. Because managing anxiety and transforming your relationship with worst-case thinking are two different things. Managing it means learning to cope with the storm every time it comes. Transforming it means changing the conditions that create the storm in the first place. And the first step is something almost no one does. You sit with the worst-case scenario. Deliberately. Consciously. With full awareness. Not to suffer. Not to spiral. But to examine it. To look directly at the thing your mind is convinced will destroy you, and to ask it some honest questions. What is the actual probability of this happening? Not the felt probability, which your anxious brain has inflated to 100%. The real probability, based on evidence, based on how similar situations have actually gone before. If it did happen, what would you actually do? Not what does your brain predict you would do, which is collapse and be unable to cope. But what have you actually done in difficult situations before? What resources do you have? Who would you call? What steps would you take? How long would the impact last? Your brain almost always predicts permanent, irreversible damage from worst-case outcomes. But most of what we fear and most of what we actually experience is temporary. We move through it. We adapt. We find new ways. These questions don't silence the anxiety, but they begin to shrink it. They pull the worst-case scenario from the realm of overwhelming feeling into the realm of something you can actually think about. And once you can think about it, it no longer has complete control over you. There's a practice that people who have transformed their anxiety describe again and again. And it sounds almost too simple to be powerful. But the research behind it is undeniable. Writing it down. When you write down your worst-case scenario, something shifts in the brain. The act of translating a swirling, overwhelming mental experience into concrete words forces a different part of your brain to engage. The language centers. The parts associated with narrative and structure and meaning-making. And these parts are calmer, more organized, more capable of perspective. The experience in your head feels enormous and formless and everywhere. The experience on the page has edges. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It can be read. It can be questioned. It can be responded to. People who journal about their anxieties report not just feeling better in the short term, but actually showing physiological changes. Lower cortisol levels, better immune function, improved sleep. Because the act of writing pulls the fear from the body and gives it a container outside you. You are externalized the internal. And once something is outside you, it is no longer you. You can look at it. You can talk to it. You can argue with it. You can decide how much authority to give it. A fear that lives only in your nervous system has total power. A fear written on a page is just words. Here's the final layer. The one that ties everything together. Your worst-case thinking is not your enemy. It never was. It is a deeply loyal, deeply exhausted guardian that has been on duty since before you knew what anxiety was. It has been scanning the horizon for dangers that might hurt you, rehearsing disasters so you'd be ready, working overtime, every day, with no rest, trying to keep you safe. And it has never been thanked for this. It has only ever been fought, or ignored, or medicated, or told to shut up, which, if you were a loyal protector being constantly rejected, would probably just make you try harder. Speak louder. Become more insistent. What happens when you thank it? When you say, I see what you're doing. I know why you're doing it. You've been trying to protect me, and I appreciate that. But I'm going to take it from here. This sounds simple. It sounds almost childish. But it works in a way that pure suppression never does. Because you're not fighting the system. You're acknowledging it. You're integrating it. You're taking authority without going to war. The brain that learns to have this conversation with itself, to hear the alarm, to understand its origin, to thank the guardian, and then make a conscious choice about how to respond, that brain is not less sensitive. It is not less feeling. It is not less human. It is more free. Because here is the truth that everything in this video has been building toward. You were built to imagine the worst. That capacity is ancient and powerful, and it has been essential to human survival. But you were also built for something else. For curiosity, for connection, for creativity, for presence, for joy. These capacities are just as real, just as human, just as wired into who you are. The worst-case scenario machine takes up space that belongs to your life. It fills hours and days, and sometimes years with futures that will never come, with losses that will never happen, with disasters rehearsed but never experienced. And while it does that, the actual present, the real texture of your actual life, passes by quietly, unnoticed, unlived. You are not your worst-case scenario. You are the person watching it. And you always had the power to change the channel. The shift starts not with silence, but with seeing. Seeing the pattern, naming the system, understanding where it came from and what it was trying to do. And then, slowly, gently, with compassion for the ancient frightened part of you that built it, choosing something different. Not every day, not all at once, but one moment, one breath, one chosen thought at a time. That is how the mind learns. That is how it heals. That is how a person who was born to worry learns, finally, to live. So here's what I want you to do right now. Think about the worst-case scenario that visits you most often. The one your brain has been rehearsing for years. The one that feels the most real, the most certain, the most like it's definitely coming. And I want you to ask yourself honestly, has it happened yet? Drop your answer in the comments. And tell me what your brain keeps predicting that keeps not coming true. You might be surprised how many people are carrying the exact same catastrophe. The same script. The same disaster film playing on repeat. You are not alone in this. You never were.